All right, it is precisely 9 o'clock by my phone, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Seil. I'm the Deputy Director of Research with the One Earth Future Foundation, and I get to go first, which is a bit of a challenge because the training committee asked us to be kind of personal in terms of explaining our past histories and our thinking. So I'm going to try to do that without sounding either egotistical or boring, and I don't know if I will be able to thread that needle, but I will try. The first challenge I faced in that regard is the title of my talk, because in 1997 I saw Kurt Vonnegut give a talk, and he titled his talk, "How to Get a Job Like Mine," because he explained that he really liked his job, he wanted to talk about that, and that was what he wanted to talk about. So when I was invited to do this, that was immediately where my mind went, but I'm not Kurt Vonnegut, and without explaining that job, or that talk, I think it sounded like a bit egotistical. So I wanted to put it up there, tell the backstory about it. But that said, I agree with Kurt in that I do like my job, and I think it's something that's kind of fun to talk about. So hopefully you all will as well. So what is that job? Well, like I said, I'm the Deputy Director of Research with the One Earth Future Foundation. OEF is a NGO, a non-governmental organization, structured as a research and operating foundation that works in the area of international security. Specifically, we work on developing international institutions that support peace, either peace building, which is preventing violent conflict, or peacemaking, which is stopping ongoing violent conflict. Our primary areas of focus are in maritime security. We work with the EU, NATO, and the contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia around maritime piracy, helping support the counter-piracy institutions, which are both stopping the ongoing outbreak of piracy and then also preventing the escalation or increase in piracy. We also have operational interests in supporting economic development in Somalia. We are developing a program looking at the role of the private sector in preventing mass atrocities, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And then on the research side, we are interested in the relationship between international institutional structure and performance. We have 43 staff, and our 2014 operating budget was $6.8 million. We are an endowed foundation with a single living donor. For those of you who are interested in NGO work, that question, where does your funding come from, really defines a lot of the operations, and you will learn that living donor foundations are a very interesting and unique kind of place, but increasingly common, so that it's likely that if you're interested in this, these are the kinds of organizations you're going to come up against. On the research side, because I am a research psychologist by training, we are tasked with producing material that is evidence-based, that is methodologically rigorous, and that informs either the work of our implementation projects or the foundational interest of the organization, the question of how do global governance systems support peace internationally. So we produce academic articles. One of our researchers had a piece in the Journal of Peace Research a couple of months ago. We produce policy briefs, which we deliver to policymakers. We produce research reports, kind of standalone pieces. And then we try to do a lot more communications. It's fairly similar to the work of a postdoc, except that it's really focused on applied impact, and there's a much, much heavier communications piece than most social psychologists are trained in. Our academic articles within the institution, people are like, okay, that's great. I had a piece published in Foreign Affairs in the web edition last week, and that was what people were really excited about. It was a blog. I mean, it was really just a fancy blog, but as far as the organization goes, that was seen as much more interesting and important than an article in a 2.5 impact factor journal. We do have a blog, and if you're interested, check it out here. The research department has 11 staff. There's 2 management, there's myself, and my associate director, who is a quantitative political psychologist. There are 3 PhD research associates, 1 evolutionary psychologist, and then 1 quantitative political scientist, and 1 public affairs or public administration PhD who does more analytical work. We have 2 research support staff, that's basically research assistants and filling in for graduate students because we don't have graduate students. We have 2 monitoring and evaluation staff because the department is responsible for the monitoring and evaluation of all our programs across the organization. And we have 2 operations and logistics support. That's meeting planning, communications. One of them is the managing editor for the journal Global Governance, which we are the institutional host for. Incidentally, it's a very good journal. If your work fits there, please consider applying. One of the things that the training committee asked me to talk about is what is my job like on a day-to-day basis. Well, because I am the manager of this department, 90% of it is administrative. I spend most of my day in meetings. My job is to set up the organizational strategy, set up our key performance indicators, monitor the performance of the research department, and just make sure that everything is running on track. Also hiring and larger strategic planning. The vast, vast majority of my day is in meetings. I get maybe 10% of my day to collect data, to write, and to do actual research activities. I still do get to do some, but mostly I'm an administrator these days. Now, for the research associates, which many people would be coming in at, that's flipped. It's about 90% core research, 10% administrative. I try to keep the kind of meeting burden on the staff as low as possible. And I think on average, they're in meetings not directly relating to research projects, maybe 45 minutes a week. Yeah, so that is what we do. We produce research that is attempting to influence policy, either directly through our partners on the implementation side, where they have access to these global institutions, or through other channels, which are basically these days mass media channels. How did I get this job? Well, I have a long history of work with the nonprofit sector. Before I went to graduate school, I had already been working in the NGO sector for about 10 years, give or take. It was one reason I went to graduate school. Many of the issues that nonprofits are working on are empirical questions, and I was aware there was a lot of research out there that would address their operations and that they were really not aware of it. So it was one of my thinking going to graduate school. During graduate school, it was a very classic, straight over home plate academic training, except that University of Texas, as you will see, is a little bit unusual in that I think that UT as a program is more willing to kind of push students in kind of unusual directions. About half of the speakers are from UT, which I think says something. After I got my PhD, I had a choice between a postdoc position at the University of Exeter and a nonprofit position with an organization I had been working for as a contractor. The interesting thing about that nonprofit position, and this will be a theme that I come back to in my talk, is that I had been working as a contract researcher, helping them with some of their work. They didn't have a posted position for a researcher. I went to them and said, hey, I have to make a decision about what I'm going to do with my career. I have this other job offer. Would you be interested in hiring me full time? There are many, many more NGOs that need PhD researchers than there are NGOs that know that they need PhD researchers. And if you develop a relationship with an NGO, it's a lot easier to convert that to a full-time position than it is to just kind of apply out of the blue. So that's something for you to think about if you're interested in this kind of a career. Why did I pick the NGO track? Why did I pick that instead of the postdoc position? Well, there's a couple of reasons. A lot of them are internal. Some of them have to do with my personal values. For me, I get more satisfaction out of the research that I can point to having an impact than the research that I was casting out into the academic journals and waiting for somebody to cite it. Your mileage may vary. This is really a question of kind of what your individual interests are, but for me, I like the fact that I can point to a research memo that doesn't ever get published, doesn't ever get cited, but I can say, this transnational corporation changed how they're monitoring social impact because we provided it to them, which is something that we were able to do just recently. And also, I wanted to support evidence-based practice. To the extent that I believe in anything, to the extent that I have an actual thing that I value, it's the idea that social problems are technical problems, and if we approach them as empirical problems with empirical solutions rather than moral challenges, we can actually make the world a better place. In the NGO policy world, that's called evidence-based practice, and you would think it would be pretty straightforward and kind of uncontroversial, but you would be wrong. The vast majority of policy decisions, both at the political level, but also, frankly, at a lot of institutional levels that have nothing to do with politics, are made off of individual values, ephemeral pressures, things that people believe to be true but are not actually backed by evidence. And there's been a movement in the nonprofit sector and in the IGO, the International Governmental Organization sector, to change that, to move towards evidence-based practice. By operating in the NGO sector, I'm able to support that, not just the specific work that we do, but also the abstract idea that social problems have technical solutions. They're not these kind of big moral morasses that you can't solve. There were also professional interests. The thing about NGOs, especially the international NGO sector where I've spent most of my career, is that their operations produce an enormous amount of really exciting data. So within 2 years of starting as a research officer, I was a PI on a randomized controlled trial that we were running in Java, Indonesia. I don't think I would have been able to do that as a postdoc at Exeter, certainly not at that point in my career. Since then, I've been able to set up, right now we're collecting data on the long-term impact of piracy on the behavioral and emotional well-being of seafarers in Ukraine, India, and the Philippines. I mean, that's a 3-arm study conducted internationally that the operations of my organization give me access to without having to go through the separate process of like going out and finding all of these folks. That, to me, is really exciting. There's data just lying around to play with. And then finally, there were more ephemeral reasons, which is not to say stupid, but these are maybe not the best reasons to make major life decisions on, but I can't ignore the fact that they were there. One is a fairly high degree of burnout and disillusionment with academic research. There's a line about, whenever I think about people finishing their PhD, I think about Child Roll into the Dark Tower Came, the poem by Byron. There's a line there that says something like, when this knight is on a long quest, somebody tells him, hey, here's the end of your quest, and he says something along the lines of, my heart gave no spring of joy at the end of my long quest prophesied, so much as weary gladness that some end might there be. Like, that was my experience of finishing the PhD. And I know a lot of people who are in that same place. For me personally, the academic discourse was not really a source of satisfaction. I didn't feel like it had a lot of impact. I felt like my research was not being picked up. Now, I gotta say, I don't agree with that anymore. A couple of years has given me some distance from it. I think that I would be perfectly happy in an academic career. But at the time, I was burned out. This gave me an opportunity to do something new. And then finally, I wanted to travel. At that time, I hadn't really traveled much, and working in the international NGO sector, gave me opportunities to travel, and this one has bitten me in the ass because I have traveled so much that my feet are hardly on the ground anymore, and in the past year, I've been in Tokyo, Frankfurt, Geneva, Odessa, Ukraine, Mumbai, India, Manila, Philippines, and that's actually a lot harder on your kind of social and personal life than I would have predicted. On the other side, I've gotten to see some really cool stuff. And one of the things I like to do is I like to take pictures of street art whenever I travel. And that top picture is my favorite piece of street art in the entire world right now from Yogyakarta, Java, Indonesia. So these were my kind of personal pressures that led to me taking this position. Your mileage may vary. So this is why I did it. Why might you do it? Why might you pick this career track? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First off, the simple availability of jobs. Aaron Clauset is a computer scientist at the University of Colorado. We work with him on occasion. He just had this piece published in one of the science offshoots, tracking what institutions are producing tenure-track professors for Research One organizations or universities. He found that 25% of institutions are producing 71 to 86% of all tenure-track faculty. So you are all aware of how hard it is to get an academic job. This is illuminating because it suggests that it may actually even be harder than that. If you're not part of that 25%, the odds are not good. I mean, you're all aware of this. I don't want to belabor the point, but I really do feel like the academic hiring system is not only unsustainable, but borderline immoral. In the NGO sector, on the other hand, there are an increasing number of jobs for reasons that I will talk about on the next slide. So, I mean, let's be honest. This is one reason you might want to consider it, is there are jobs. Other than that, though, which is kind of a cold comfort, I think, there are reasons why this is actually really attractive. One is there are opportunities to conduct good research. Like I said, the organizations, by their nature of their operations, are producing a lot of really exciting data. And I've gotten the opportunity to work on international comparative stuff that I never would have thought that I would have the opportunity to play with if you look at the work that I did as a graduate student, or even the opportunities that I would have had, in postdoc or later academic careers. I mean, this is cool stuff, and if you're interested in this kind of international data, this is a really good place to get data. Also, it's odd, but it's actually, in my experience, easier to find grants and financial resources for research in the NGO sector than in the academic sector. And that's because while there are fewer big funders, I mean, the NSF will fund a 501c3, but they don't tend to. There are a lot of smaller funders, and they're increasingly becoming interested in the idea of evidence-based practice and funding work that demonstrates that the work that you're doing actually has a concrete applied impact. That means that there's a lot more places you can go to look for research, and most NGOs will have a development department that will help you in finding resources. So this is something that, in my experience, is actually slightly easier to get funding to do your work in the nonprofit sector than in academics. There's a shorter pathway to impact. NGOs are mission-oriented organizations. They are focused on having some change in the world. If you find an organization that aligns with your personal values, this can be a deep source of satisfaction. Your mileage may vary. Not everybody is motivated by that, but if you are, this is a really good opportunity. And finally, this opens the door to other careers by providing a pathway to management and nonprofit experience. So the thing is, one of the unfortunate things about a PhD is you become so specialized as a researcher, it limits your ability to apply to other positions that don't directly relate to research. Working into a research position in the NGO sector is going to require you to develop skills as a nonprofit manager, as a project manager, and develop experience that you can then use to make a lateral step sideways to be a program manager or a project manager if that's something you're interested in. On the other hand, there's plenty of room for you to continue to develop as a researcher in the nonprofit sector. It just provides a little bit more of a well-rounded skill set that you can then use as an entry chip to other positions if later in your career you decide that's something you're interested in. So why might they pick you? Why would a nonprofit be interested in a social or personality psychologist? Well, first off, there is an increasing demand for evidence-based practice. Like I said, starting in the mid-90s, the big funders, particularly Rockefeller and then Gates, now even some of the governmental funders are starting to say, we are not interested in funding work that you think is going to have an impact. We want to fund work that you can demonstrate has an impact. And that means you need to be able to show, using best available research methodologies, that the work that your organization is doing is actually doing what you think it is. It's at the point where this is almost a buzzword. There's a backlash developing. I mean, it's developed enough that there was a Doonesbury cartoon about it. But I mean, there's a debate happening in the international development field right now that goes something along the lines of, are randomized controlled trials the best way of demonstrating that a development program works, or should they be the only way that we test whether a development program works? Now, that's not 100%. Like I said, there's a debate, there's backlash against it. But it's absolutely the case that increasingly NGOs need PhD-level researchers to provide the evidence that their funders are demanding that the work they're doing actually works. Or in some cases, they are faced squarely with the fact that it doesn't work because an awful lot of nonprofits are not organized around the best available evidence about what kinds of programs should be done. So there's that side of it too. Sometimes you get to tell people, hey, this is not actually impacting people in the way that we thought it was. On the other hand, that's kind of something that's important for organizations to know. Secondly, social and personality psychologists are, in my experience, unusually well-rounded as social scientists. As an applied researcher, you need to be a utility infielder. You need to be able to do pretty much anything that is requested to answer the research question that you're given. That means that you need to be familiar with experimental design, survey design, qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis. And I'm working with a lot of political scientists who, in my experience, the average quantitative political scientist that I've worked with is better at statistical analysis of large data sets than the average social psychologist that I've worked with. But they are completely at a loss when it comes to survey design, to qualitative work, to all of the things that most social psychologists are at least, passing familiar with. This is really, I think it's a utility infielder degree as far as the actual research skills and methods go. And that's valuable. I mean, that's not something that I think you were necessarily encouraged to realize is valuable because it's not, it's just kind of taken as a matter of course. But frankly, in the real world, being able to say, I know how to answer that question, pretty much regardless of what the question is a useful skill. And that connects to my next point, which is that you have skills that you are not trained to appreciate. This is one of the interesting things to me about getting a PhD. It is taken for granted that you will pretty much learn whatever you need to learn in order to get your PhD, whether that's management of teams, timeline, funding, project management skills. I taught myself to code in PHP and Perl because nobody was going to write a website for me. These are marketable skills. They're not only marketable skills, they're fairly rare skills. And in the real world, having a PhD is seen as, in some cases, sometimes people are like, oh, you're an ivory tower academic, but frequently people realize, okay, this means that you have the ability to just execute a project. That's rare. It's not only rare, it's something that people will pay a premium for. And as a graduate student, you're not actually encouraged to really formally develop those skills, to acknowledge that that's the case, or even really appreciate the fact that you are either learning or demonstrating the ability to just get stuff done in a way that most institutions will actually pay for. So that's something that I would like to change as far as getting both graduate students and, more folks in the NGO sector are aware of what it actually means to finish your PhD. So here are the downsides. This is where I will lose some of you. There are some fairly serious downsides to working in the nonprofit sector. One is the pay. Typically, an NGO will pay less than any other institution for a comparable CV. It's not going to be enormously less, but it will be less. So in the case of most of our incoming PhDs, they're turning down positions, tenure track positions that start between 82 and 85, and they're coming in at OEF between 72 and 75. So that's a hit. I mean, you are taking a pay cut, but it's not an enormous pay cut. It's not a 50% pay cut. You're still in the same basic ballpark. The nonprofit sector is the nonprofit sector. It is defined by the fact that it doesn't care very much about money, and that comes right down to the pay. I need to be upfront about that. However, especially in the case of US NGOs, pay is a matter of public record. You can look up the 990s, the IRS reporting, and as a part of that, they are required to report, typically it's the top 5 highest paid positions. So you can get a sense of what NGOs, or what the organization you're interested in is actually paying staff. Secondly, there's a relative lack of research independence. NGOs are mission-oriented organizations. The work that you do has to be in support of that mission. You don't get to come in and say, hey, here's what I want to research. Ideally, you're hired to a place where there's close overlap between what they want to do and what you want to do. But at the end of the day, if there's a disagreement, management wins. The organization exists to accomplish its mission. Your work has to be in support of that. Job security. This is the big one. This is where I tend to lose people when I'm talking about this, because obviously a tenured position is the most secure position that you can have, pretty much. The problem with the nonprofit sector is there's a lot of churn. A lot of organizations are on what we call soft money. That is, they don't have an endowment, they don't have existing funds. They are getting operating budgets or operating funding from grants, and when the grant runs out, if they haven't identified the next grant, then the organization goes away. It happens with some frequency. The organization Psychology Beyond Borders that I worked with, it was doing international disaster mental health. I loved that job, but the funding was just not stable, and I was saying, hey, I looked at it and I said, we don't have the operating funds for another 18 months of work, and we don't have, and in my estimation, we weren't going to find it, so I jumped ship. I took a different job. That's kind of part of the NGO sector. The flip side of it, though, is there's a lot of NGOs, there's a lot more churn, there's a higher number of jobs, and once you establish yourself as somebody working in this, it is fairly easy to just kind of move from one organization to another. But that's something I've got to be upfront about, because otherwise you could be shocked when an organization that you thought was fine and stable suddenly goes away. That's one reason why it's important to do your research, to look at the 990s, to look at how their income changes from year to year, and what their assets are, because that can help you avoid, here's a risk. And then this also has my favorite Tumblr, which is workingatanonprofit.tumblr.com, which is just a Tumblr composed of people who work at nonprofits bitching about all the stuff that comes up when you work at a nonprofit. So if you want to get the actual full-on negative experience, go check that out. All right, so finally, how to get these positions? Well, there's a couple of ways to do it, but they basically boil down to either you find a job and apply for it, or you find an organization and convert a relationship into a job. In the first case, there are several websites which are specified for nonprofit careers. Idealist.org is probably the best. I checked last week, and there were 546 positions posted in the scientific and research category. There were 46 positions that specified that they required a PhD in order to get the position. And so there are jobs out there. This is probably your best source for it. You can also find large NGOs that frequently hire PhDs, and the two that I would really point to right off the bat would be RAND and Pew. Both of these are enormous, well-established organizations that almost always have a behavioral scientist position open that a social or personality psychologist might be credible for. And then finally, OEF, oneearthfuture.org. We have 3 positions for PhDs posted right now. One for somebody who is familiar with Somalia, one for somebody who is familiar with Colombia, and one for somebody who is, again, a utility infielder, somebody that is interested in institutional performance, peace, and security questions. So if you think that might be you, please, I encourage you to apply. And then finally, you can find an organization and get to know them. You can develop a relationship. In my case, this is how I got my first PhD out of or my first job out of PhD. One of our faculty, Jamie Pennebaker, who is currently standing in the back of the room, was a board member for an NGO called Issues Deliberation Australia America. They were looking for somebody to conduct research. He said, hey, I know a guy that knows stuff about deliberative democracy. Connor, why don't you apply for it? And I was able to convert that into a full-time position, as I already discussed. So, you know, you are probably at a point of your career, whether you're a postdoc or a graduate student, where you have the freedom to say, hey, here's research that's interesting to me. Here's a nonprofit that cares about this research. Approach them, pitch the research to them. They will probably be extremely enthusiastic about working with you, especially if you can find your own funding for it. And then, take a step forward. Say, would you like to hire me for a full-time position? I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to take some initiative to find an NGO in your area that would benefit from your expertise, find some funding, and I'm happy to talk about that at the mentoring lunches later if you want, and then, just see what you can do. That also will get you some exposure to the nonprofit sector, so you can make a decision about whether it's something you really want to do or not. And I am 5 minutes over, so I will stop here and turn it over for Q&A. Except for I will say that if you're interested in our work, please follow us on Twitter. In fact, please follow us on Twitter, because I'm in a competition with my associate director, and she is currently 4 people ahead. So, so yeah, any questions? Yes, ma'am. It's extremely dependent on the organization itself, and I shouldn't make it sound like every organization has, an 18-month half-life. I think that a lot of organizations are very stable and are able to get continuing funding. I would expect, while you were establishing your career in this sector, that you're probably going to be working at some of the smaller or more unstable areas, and I think it wouldn't be unusual to expect to get a new job every 3 to 5 years. But frequently you can stay in the same geographic area. There's a lot of NGOs in almost every major city, and so it's not a question of moving across the U.S. I think that once you are more established, in my experience, people take one of 2 tracks. They either end up at the big endowed foundation and then work there for as long as they want, or they branch out as a consultant and basically develop their independent career, using the networks that they've built, in which case they're never really working full-time for any one organization for any period of time. But that's not a bad career. It pretty much puts you in control of your own work and your own hours. So I would say, on the worst-case scenario, you'd be looking at every 3 to 5 years. But typically, that's not going to be the case for everybody or every institution. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When sort of researching different nonprofits and figuring out if they have research arms, is there sort of just trolling their websites? Is that the best way to go, or are there other ways of more efficiently finding out if they sort of have research arms that have PhDs on the team?
There's 2 ways to go, kind of bottom up or top down. The bottom up would be go to Idealist or go to the places where they're posting positions and look to see there. The top down would be you identify NGOs that you're interested in and then go to their websites directly or contact their ED. Frequently, organizations may be doing research that they're not, but they may not have a fully developed research arm as a kind of a part of their organization. I think it's just the same as any other position. It's always going to be the most interesting to both you and the organization if you identify interests and expertise that overlap. So if there's something that you think that your work directly applies to, I have a friend who does bullying, and I mean, there's so many NGOs that are concerned about bullying. I would say, start by looking at what are the NGOs that are out there that are in an area that you're interested in, and then, go to their websites. But don't just stop there. If there's an organization you're really interested in and they don't have a research arm, email the ED. People are always interested in replying, especially because, again, I mean, y'all are coming in with a fairly high degree of expertise in areas that if you're picking the right NGO, that they really care about. Being able to say, hey, I've conducted all of this research on bullying or whatever, can we talk? Most EDs are probably going to say, yeah, sure, that's worth 45 minutes of my time.
And what ED you mean?
Executive director, sorry. Typically, most organizations, that's the head. The typical NGO, there's a board which provides the strategic oversight and selects the managers, and then there's typically an executive director position. Increasingly, some organizations are moving towards a parallel construction with corporations as you get more and more people coming out of the corporate sector and founding NGOs. So my own organization doesn't have an ED. We have a president and a chief operating officer and all of that kind of structure. But still, I think executive directors are the most typical positions. You had a question in the back.
Yeah, I was just curious what the quality control process for science in like NGO sector is like. Is there a peer review sort of thing? Do you police each other? What's that?
It's extraordinarily variable. I think that one reason that we do, at OEF, one reason that we publish in academic journals is that it provides us with legitimacy. We can point to it and say we've gone through the kind of gold standard for peer review. Most frequently, though, when we're producing a research report, we have content reviewers who are looking at it because they know something about piracy, and then we have methodology reviewers who are looking at it because they know something about methodology. But the problem is it's not blind. There's no such thing as a blind review community for NGO, and it's actually something that a couple of research officers have talked about. It's a conversation that I've been kind of on the fringes of a couple of times, is can we set up some community that's essentially doing blind peer review for NGOs? But the problem is, most of the work that an NGO does is so focused on a specific issue, it's much more difficult to de-identify who the originating organization is. We also have an internal peer review process, and this is something where there are plenty of books written by Brookings, by the Urban Institute, and by other organizations that are facing the same question. We have an internal review that is, again, not blind, but all our PhDs are checking off each other's works. I think it's the Urban Institute that actually does that with accountability, so that if something comes out and it is found to contain a methodological error, not only is the author he may lose his job, but certainly is treated, the author has some degree of accountability, but the reviewer does as well. We haven't gone that far. So basically, it really varies from organization to organization. But with the increasing focus on evidence-based practice, that means there's an increasing focus on methodological rigor, which means that these questions are coming up more and more. Any other questions? Yes?
Connor, thank you for your talk. That was really interesting. I have a question. This could be useful information for both graduate students and their advisors. You made a really good point, I think, which is that often students don't realize the practical skills that they have. But in order to use those to your advantage, you have to develop some meta-awareness of them and some ability to articulate those. Do you have any suggestions for how we can do that, either teach our students to do that or students themselves learn how to describe or talk about your rare skills in a way? Because I think when you're embedded in the grad school process, you just think of, oh, my advisor told me I have to do this thing, so I'm going to do it. But you don't think of it in terms of, wow, I'm developing a marketable skill.
Yep.
Where do you go to learn the language to talk about your skills in a way that makes them marketable?
That is a really good question. Our organization works with Steve Pinker, and his most recent book is on writing. And I had a conversation with him in October where we were complaining about the fact that most grad programs do not train students in writing, not in any formal way. I mean, if you're expected to produce scientific writing, you kind of have to do it, but you don't get any formal training in how to be a good writer. In addition to that, project management. Project management is a technical skill set. It's a fairly well-developed technical skill set. You can actually get a certification as a project management professional. As a matter of fact, the Department of Defense requires it for civilian employees over a certain level of management. And so I think that there's a couple of ways to go about it. One is, I really wish grad programs would train those skills in a more formal way. Because they're absolutely necessary for producing good research. I mean, a poorly managed research project is going to be over budget, late, and not deliver the research and it's going to end up just as messed up as if it was poorly designed from a methodological standpoint. So I would encourage programs to start thinking about these soft skills, writing, project management, things like that, and actually, setting up training or support for students. On the flip side, how do you talk about it? Well, you may want to look at project management certification. It's you know, it's a little pricey because you have to have formal education, you have to get the actual certification, but the thing about it is that it's kind of a transferable certification, and within the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the military sector, people look at that certification and say, okay, you know, you are kind of stamped as knowing how to do it. But even if you don't want to go that far, I would say look at some of the buzzwords that exist in the kind of the non-academic sector. Project management. In writing your CV, don't just say, you know, I have these 5 publications. Talk about the fact that in order to get those 5 publications, you led a team of 5, you know, undergraduate research assistants for data collection and analysis for 18 months. And then on the writing side, I mean, this is kind of a challenge because I know a political scientist who was turned down for tenure because he had written too much in foreign affairs. Now, he had a great academic publication record, but just the fact that he was publishing in these more pop journals was in and of itself sufficient that he didn't get tenure. From my point of view, that's an indictment of the academy, but it's also a real concern. And so if you're interested in a PhD position, you know, be careful where you, or a faculty position, you know, be careful where you publish. But that said, I really think that social psychology has systematically failed in getting ourselves into the popular discourse. And that's changing a little bit. I like how Sanjay Gupta's, you know, the NPR social science correspondent, a lot of the stuff that he covers is social psychology. But still, I was in mid-rant about this morning. It really frustrates me, the attention that behavioral economics is getting. Because they're doing really, really good work, but a lot of it is work that we did 20, 30, 40 years ago, but we have failed to express to the general public. So they're getting policy attention, they're getting Nobel Prizes, they're getting all of this credit that social psychology could be getting because we are not writing in the same areas that they're writing or pushing it into the same kind of policy discourses that they're writing. So I would say, I would really think it would be fantastic if faculty could encourage their graduate students, or if graduate students could take their initiative to find blogs, popular magazines, any place you can write and say, hey, I have discovered something really cool, pay attention to it, not just, you know, publish it in JPSP and stop there. And then that becomes its own, you know, like the more you can point to a publication list that includes those popular publications, and that becomes its own certification. You don't have to say, I'm a good writer. You can show, you know, I'm writing things that people are interested in. Any other questions? Sure.